So my question for us this morning is, how did you spend your New Year's Day? How did you spend the 1st of January this year? Now this, for some of you, this feels like a lifetime ago, the 1st of January. Can you remember what you did on the 1st of January? It's obviously traditional. People would have like a meal and then maybe go for their New Year's Day walk. That's kind of the thing, isn't it? I can't remember what the weather was because I wasn't here. This is how I spent my 1st of January. If we go to the next slide, first slide or wherever it is, go to the next one. This is how I spent the 1st of January, and in the desert, getting completely covered in sand. This is us on quad bikes and sandboarding in Morocco, and we drove for an hour to get to this location, and then we had to get onto quad bikes and then drive for another 30 minutes to get to this kind of remote beach area with dunes, and it was amazing because we climbed up to the top of this ridge. You can see the ridge here, and as soon as you got to the top of the ridge, the wind hit you. And it was those classic kind of sandstorms where, like, we had goggles on, we had hoods up, we had a buff across our faces, and just getting pummeled by the sand and the wind, and just like, okay, who likes to spend time in the desert? And we got absolutely covered in sand, like you would not believe. Like 3 days later, I'm still like scratching my head and finding sand. And I've been for a shower 3 or 4 times to just try and get the sand. And I don't have long hair. I don't know if you noticed. And there was still sand. We got home, and like I think a pair of trousers that had been through the wash and stuff. And I would put my hand in my pocket, and I was like, sand from Morocco. It's still here. The sand got everywhere. And we only spent a morning in the desert. Can you imagine what happens if you spent 40 years in the desert? Because the wilderness leaves a mark on us. The wilderness leaves a mark on us. Today we're starting a new series exploring that journey that the people of Israel took from Egypt to the Promised Land through the wilderness. Today is called Welcome to the Wilderness. And this 40-year journey is significant. And it's a story that's quite one of those stories that's pivotal in the whole of the biblical narrative. You find it comes up again and again. And I'm deliberately using this word wilderness because it's the term that gets used throughout the Bible to describe this period. Now, we know the Bible, we looked at the Bible, how it's made up a little bit last year. It's these 66 books with different authors at different times, written over thousands of years. And yet, these patterns repeat themselves again and again. It's astounding that this book that's so diverse actually ends up with these repeating patterns. And wilderness is one of those patterns. The Bible's fascinating because it's got these patterns that repeat themselves, and if you're paying attention, you get to notice it. And so whenever you read about a wilderness or going out to the desert or any of these sort of terms in the Bible, it's because the authors are trying to tell you something. Now, for the people whose lives we're reading about and the people who wrote down these words, we know they were in the Middle East. We know that they were actually physically surrounded by the wilderness. So it's no surprise that the wilderness becomes a massive theme for how they think about God and life. And so everywhere around them was this hostile environment, this desert environment, which was a dangerous place to be. They would have been very aware that there was no water there. It's difficult to survive in the wilderness. And so you were better if you were traveling to make sure you stuck to the cities or the villages, because there you could sustain life. And so that's the culture in which they lived and they wrote. And so the wilderness takes on a kind of life of its own. And when we read about the wilderness in the Bible, it usually represents a few different things. We'll go to the next slide, Phil. This is a definition of the wilderness in the Bible. So the wilderness is a place of danger and testing. But the wilderness is also a place of encounter with God. And finally, the wilderness is a place of transformation. These are the themes that get picked up throughout the Bible whenever the wilderness is being talked about. And so often is the case when we've got these big themes that go through the whole Bible, we need to ground it in the story of creation because that's where it all begins. So we go to the next slide. In Genesis 2, where we read about the whole story of the creation of the Garden of Eden and the creation of humanity, wilderness is right there at the beginning. And we read, and we don't have time to read it today, but we read that the earth was completely without any life, no plants, no rain. That's the description at the start of Genesis 2. What's that? That's wilderness. No life, just dust. That's the beginning that we get, the picture we get at the beginning of Genesis 2. And then it says, God causes a spring to come up from the ground and bring water. And water, of course, being the first ingredient for life. And then God goes to the wilderness, picks up some of that dust. And what does he do? He forms the dust and makes humans. And where does he do that? He doesn't do that in the garden. He does that in the wilderness. He takes the dust from the wilderness, he forms humanity, and then he picks them up and he places them in a garden. This is a garden that has been created in the wilderness. God has created a garden, this Garden of Eden we call, in the wilderness. He's taken man, formed him in the wilderness, and put him into the garden. These are the details that we perhaps miss. The wilderness is right there at the beginning of the story. We have this picture of this garden, this place of beauty and tranquility and connection with God and everything being amazing, but it's actually surrounded by wilderness. And why do we find that out? We find that out because Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden. And the goal is they live in this garden to follow his voice and to follow his lead and know and trust his voice. And we, of course, know what happens. They don't. And the result is they get cast from the garden into the wilderness. And remember one of the consequences for Adam and Eve, it says, to dust you shall return. And again, this is a picture of like back out into the wilderness. And so the struggle begins. Welcome to the wilderness. And throughout the rest of the story, people at different times in the story find themselves in a wilderness. This is a theme that gets picked up again and again. And there's different reasons they're in the wilderness. Sometimes it's because of their own choices. So, for example, Moses kills an Egyptian. And what does he do? He flees to the wilderness to live in the wilderness of Midian. Sometimes it's the decisions of others that lead people into the wilderness. So you've got the example of Hagar, who Abraham and Sarah cast out into the wilderness. So others force her into the wilderness. Elijah would be another example. Again, I don't have time to go into all these stories, but after defeating the prophets of Baal, he has this breakdown. And where does he go? He goes to the wilderness in depression and anxiety. And what happens? God meets him in the wilderness, protects him, provides for him. So I just want to open your eyes to the fact that this wilderness theme is everywhere in the Bible. And it's always a bit of a contradiction, the wilderness. It's both a place of harshness, which tests people, and it forms them and changes them, but it's also the place where God meets people. God meets people in the wilderness. And ultimately, God loves to turn wildernesses into gardens. That's the story of the Bible. And the wilderness seems to have this way of stripping away all the distraction and inspiring people towards dependence on God. It's almost like when all the other sources of life are stripped away, God is what we have. So the wilderness is a story of reliance and trust in God. And so whenever you read someone's going to the wilderness, you can be sure that one of these things is about to happen. The wilderness is one of the places that changes and prepares us. There's lots of other places I could refer to that talk about the wilderness. Think about David when he gets anointed king. What happens? He's then on the run with Saul for, I can't remember how many years, 10 years or something, in the wilderness, preparing him to become king. Isaiah refers to the wilderness all the time and says, I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. So it's in all the prophetic language, it's in all the stories, there's a wilderness element. New Testament, where is John the Baptizer? In the wilderness. And what does he say about himself? I am the voice of the one calling in the wilderness, make straight the path for the Lord. So when you open your eyes and you start seeing this wilderness pattern, you're like, it's everywhere. So I think we need to pay attention to it. And as I say, the wilderness often represents a few things. A place of danger and testing, a place of encounter with God, and a place of transformation. So zooming in back into the story of the people of God moving from Egypt to this promised land that God has given them in Canaan. And the way he does this freeing them is he raises up Moses, and Moses is the one that's to lead them out into their freedom. But interestingly, as I've already referred to, how does God prepare Moses for this task? He spends 40 years in the wilderness. So Moses' life is broken up into 3 groups of 40. 40 years in Pharaoh's house. He kills the man, the Egyptian man, and then he has 40 years in the wilderness. And then he spends 40 years, again, leading the people of God through the wilderness. So he leads the people out of Egypt, and they had been under slavery for generations. And there's different debates about how long they were in Egypt, but it was at least hundreds of years. So generations had come and gone. They'd lived in slavery. And they were, in many ways, so there was a slavery. They weren't free, but they were also living in one of the wealthiest civilizations of the world. So there was a degree of affluence all around them that at some level would have impacted them. So they leave Egypt. We know the whole story. We don't have time to go into it. But they cross the Red Sea and they step into the desert, the wilderness. They go to Mount Sinai. They meet with God in the wilderness, who makes a new covenant with them. They set up the tabernacle, and then they begin this journey of wandering through the wilderness. And we've mentioned this a few times in recent weeks already, but they don't go the fast route. They don't take the shortcut. So we're going to read where it explicitly tells us why God doesn't give them the shortcut. So we're in Exodus 13, verse 17 and 18. We'll put it on the screen. Should have that slide, Phil. Exodus 13. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert towards the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. So that's what the Bible tells us about why God doesn't give them the shortcut route. So let's just look at a little map here. I've got a map. If we go to the next slide. This is the potential route. It's obviously difficult to pin down exactly, but this is the route we think the people of God took. And so what you can see is at number 1, that's where they were in Egypt. And they go out here and they go down there, and Mount Sinai somewhere down the bottom here. And then they go on this big wandering journey up here. But can you see there's a shorter way to the promised land? And the shorter way is just across the top there, where it marks the Philistines along the Mediterranean Sea. That's the journey that would have taken them 11 days if they had just gone that direction. But as we see here, there's a reason God doesn't lead them through that country. So the Philistines are the kind of arch rivals of the people of God. It develops throughout the story, but they're always there's an antagonistic relationship with the Philistines. And it's not till later it kind of breaks out into full-on war. But all the way through the story, these are kind of the rivals to Israel. And God basically says, I'm not going to go that way because you'll end up in war and you're not ready for it. And the result will be that you'll run away and you will flee back to Egypt and be in a worse state than you were before. And it says here in the passage that the people went out of Egypt ready for battle. So what's going on here? I think this little section has some really fascinating insights into the way that God thinks and the way he interacts with the people of God. It seems like they left Egypt with soldiers and weapons and kind of ready to take on the world. Can you imagine the feeling of God parting the sea for you and walking through? How powerful you'd feel? You'd be like, I'm amazing. Nothing can stop us. And so they come out of Egypt with this bravado, in a sense, of like, come on, we're ready to take on the world. But God seems to know them better than they know themselves. And that's one of the keys in this passage, is that God knows them better than they know themselves. They'd spent generations as slaves, and it was all that most of them had ever known. And that had done something to their entire psyche as a people. They had been changed and shaped by the slavery that they lived under. God knew that actually, while they looked like they might be ready to fight a battle, in reality they would crumble and find themselves running straight back to the old master. So in many ways, this longer route God takes them on is actually the compassion of God. He says, I know if you go this way, this is going to end in disaster. Let's go a different route. And it seems strange to us, but actually it's the compassion of the Lord. Because the problem wasn't at God's end. God would have been just as easy to get them through the Philistine battles. You know, we see in the chapters and books that come after that he does lead them through battles. So the problem wasn't on God's end, but God knew that the people weren't ready for that. And so this 40-year journey begins. And it begins because of the compassion of God. He knew their weakness. And he was so keen they stepped into the promises of God that he took them the long way. And this is a really interesting process. And I've heard it put like these two steps. We'll go to the next slide, Phil. The first step is get the people out of Egypt. That was the bit with all the drama. And the second bit was get Egypt out of the people. And this was the harder journey. Because the way they had been shaped and formed by their culture changed everything about the people of God. And so when we look at their failures over the next 40 years, and we can sit back and look and feel really comfortable at ourselves. But this is because of the influence they had been under for generations. The people of God had been living in a culture that was anti-Yahweh. It was anti their gods. They had not been free to worship. They'd been surrounded by all the worship of all these other gods. Decades of slavery had affected them. So yes, God could get them out of Egypt easily enough. That wasn't a trouble. But getting Egypt out of the people was the challenge. They had to form new thinking, new habits, new lifestyles, new communities. And this is what happens when they get given the law. So we read the law and we're like, oh, that's the Ten Commandments, blah, 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 blah. This was God forming a brand new habit, a new way of thinking, a new way of life for a whole people group who had fallen under the influence of Egypt. And so the journey they go on is the invitation to reform their lives after God's heart. So what about us? What does this mean for us? Well, interestingly, this journey that the people of God took from Egypt to the Promised Land is actually a picture of the Christian life. And I'm not the first person to point this out. The New Testament itself either directly says this or it's implied throughout. This journey that the people of God went becomes a pattern for what it means to be a Christian. The idea in this pattern is that Egypt actually is the influence of the world and the influence of dark spiritual powers on our lives. And God frees us. And where does he free us? He frees us at Passover, the celebration of the people of God being freed from Egypt. And he frees us by shedding the blood of a lamb, as in Exodus, but this time it's Jesus, the Son of God, shed for us. And so we get invited through salvation into a new Exodus. We've been saved, we've been set free, we are no longer in Egypt. God has made a new covenant with us. And that new covenant enables us to be children of God. It's amazing. But then we have to enter the journey. the walking daily with God. This is the walk in the wilderness, where we gradually let the influences of the world and the influences of all the things that would seek to lead us away from God, and we are being formed and shaped and changed by the wilderness so that we can be ready to receive all that God has for us. And we're replacing the world's ways with God's way. And this is the journey of discipleship. And that's why we have to remember when we talk about salvation, yes, there's moments of salvation, but actually that's the start of the journey. That's the journey we then walk for the rest of our lives. So we now, as Christians, we find ourselves living in this in-between state. We live in both the wilderness and the garden at the same time. We step into God's kingdom, as Jesus talks about it, and we live in his kingdom. We now establish his kingdom. And what we're effectively doing is we're building gardens in the wilderness. When we live for God, we live for his ways, we sit under his teachings. We are building gardens in the wilderness. One day God's kingdom will be fully realized, but we live in the in-between. We live in what's sometimes referred to as the kingdom now and not yet. One day, the whole wilderness will be transformed to a garden. And we read this in Revelation, where a garden city comes down from heaven and the whole place is transformed. But until then, we live in both. And God is leading us, like the people of God, to let go of our old ways, to plant gardens, to form and transform us. This is the journey. Welcome to the wilderness. And as a church, we feel like we're in a season where the Lord is calling us to really embrace that journey, that wilderness walk that he's calling us on, to step into the promises of God, but be prepared to be changed and transformed so that we can receive what God has for us. God wants to bless us, but to bless us, he needs us to be ready for the blessing. He needs us to prepare our hearts. And I think that the people of God and the journey that Israel takes in the desert, in many ways, is like a challenge and a warning to us. And the New Testament makes this explicit. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11, Paul writes, speaking about the wilderness journey, he says, "These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come." So Paul basically is saying, look at that story because we can learn from it, and it's going to help us in our journey. So just 3 very brief points for us today. How do we approach the wilderness? First point, we need to know God's heart. The first thing that happens when you find yourself in a wilderness where you feel like there's no life here, there's no thing, is you start to doubt who God is. Why would God bring us into the wilderness? What possible reason could God have for us to be in the wilderness? Did God bring us out of Egypt just so we could die here? And that's not a figurative thing. That's exactly what the people of God said. And it's because they lost sight of God. They didn't see that it was the compassion of God that led them on a journey. It was his love for them as a people, his desire that they would actually step into his promises that led them into the wilderness. And when things are difficult or we find ourselves in seasons where we're not seeing all the promises of God fulfilled, they're the times we're most likely to doubt who God is. But we need to know God's heart. He did all this so he could free his people and so they could live in a new land. And the people of God forgot this time and time again. That's the story that's sad to watch from the outside, is they keep forgetting God rescued us. He freed us. He's going to lead us to the promised land. And we, of course, looked at one aspect of that on our Vision Sunday, where we looked at the spies in the land. And they could have stepped into the promises of God 38 years earlier, but they failed to know who God was in his heart for them. So the wilderness journey is not God punishing us. It's actually God's mercy and his compassion, leading us to be changed into the people of God, ready for the promised land. And yes, the wilderness can sometimes be a harsh place, but it's also the place where you really get to discover the source of life, God himself. He's a good Father, and we need to trust him and know his heart. Have to hold on to the truth of who God is, even when our circumstances change around us. And Rob did a great preach on that earlier in the year. See Rob's previous message. So the second point for us is we need to learn to choose the long road. This is a difficult one for our culture, because we live in a world where everyone is after shortcuts, 30 quick hacks to this. How quickly can we get from A to B? We don't walk as many places because we can drive them. We get places as fast as we can. We kind of try and shortcut the journey, don't we? Like the thing, I don't mind flying, but waiting around in airports, oh my goodness. Hours lost in airports, soul-destroying places. But we try to shortcut all our journeys because we're just trying to get places faster. And that's the culture we live in. Everything's instant. It's got to be quick. If it's not instant, it's not real. But I think God actually calls us to walk the long road, the slow road, the road that takes longer, but actually builds meaningful change in our lives. So sometimes we need to be prepared to go slow when the world is going fast. We actually want God to shape our character and change us and shape us. And it's fascinating to me that God wasn't in a rush with the people. I mean, he gets frustrated at them, don't get me wrong. But the patience of God, 40 years. He's patient. And he's more interested in the outcome than how quickly we can get there. And he's infinitely more patient than you or I, thankfully. He's so patient, and he cares about the journey as much as he does the destination. And shortcuts might seem logical or even for us like the most efficient thing to do, but God's number one priority is not efficiency. Shortcuts actually can come with more dangers than the long road. Because if they had taken the shortcut, the people of God would have found themselves running in fear back to Egypt. And can you imagine walking back into Egypt and thinking your conditions are about to be even worse than they were before because you escaped? And when we in our lives try to take shortcuts on our walk with God, this is the danger. We end up back in Egypt. We end up back in more trouble than we were in the first place because we didn't trust the journey God had us on, which is a slow journey of change and transformation and trust. So if your journey doesn't feel fast, you don't feel like God is changing you as quick as you want, good. Embrace the long road. We might want God to zap us. We might want him to deal with that character flaw or that issue in our lives quickly. But we need to trust him that he sees the bigger picture. He knows what he's doing. And when he brings change, it's change that lasts. And then third thing for us in the wilderness is prioritizing God's voice. Every journey needs a guide. That's if you don't want to get lost. If you're going somewhere new you've never been before, I recommend taking a guide. I don't know what we did in the world before GPS and sat-navs, but apparently we used to find our way around stumbling and getting lost. But actually, having a guide is essential for the journey. And the biggest lesson the people of God had to learn was to trust his voice. Which way are you saying we should go? Which way would you lead us? And this is the heart of the whole journey. In Deuteronomy 8, Moses is reflecting on the journey. This is the end of his life. And Deuteronomy is like Moses' final words, basically, to the people of God. And he says this about the wilderness journey in Deuteronomy 8. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from God. We know that passage because Jesus quotes it later in the New Testament. But the context is the people of God needed to learn the voice of God was the most important thing in their lives, above everything. So if we prepare the journey of going on the wilderness, three things. We need to know God's heart. Be prepared to choose the long road and prioritize his voice. Welcome to the wilderness. And the good news is that God uses everything in our lives to get us ready, to prepare us. He's using stuff in your life right now to prepare you for what he's got for you. And the challenge for most of us is that we spend most of our time trying to understand what he's doing in our lives. Maybe it's just me. What's he doing in this season? Is he testing me? Is he challenging me? What's he doing in my life right now? And I think that the invitation in the wilderness is to lay all that aside, all the whys, all the complexity of all of that, and to kind of be like a child and just say, grab hold of his hand and said, I'm going with you. I'm walking with you. Because faithfulness for God isn't about understanding everything. It's about walking with him faithfully in the moment, step by step. Proverbs 3, we lean not on our own understanding. In all our ways acknowledge him, and he will make our path straight. It's an invitation to be childlike, to let him be the one that worries about removing the influence of Egypt. Because I believe the wilderness, as we began, the wilderness is designed to leave its mark. It changes us. It shapes us, like that silly story of us finding sand weeks later. When you've been in the wilderness, it marks you. It leaves a lasting impact on you. And my prayer for us as a church, and maybe you would join in praying with me, is that God would lead us on the roads that he has us, that he would prepare us for what he wants to do, and that we as a people would faithfully walk with him hand in hand. So let me just pray for us. God, I thank you that you lead us on, that you are compassionate and merciful, that you lead us like children by the hand, that we can trust you, that whether we're in the garden or the wilderness, you're our source. And I pray, God, that we would learn the lessons of the wilderness so that we can step into the promises of God. And where we feel impatient with our journey, God, I pray you'd give us grace. Help us to trust you, that you're leading us forward, that you're changing and transforming us as a people. God, we ask you to come and move in our church community in this season. Stir our hearts, God.